Good evening to you all, and welcome to the final Durham Castle Lecture of this academic year, which also doubles up as the launch of a University College and IAS joint initiative on the future of the university. We'll be collaborating and holding a series of some 10 lectures next academic year on what's the university for, to borrow a phrase, the functions of the university, the way universities are governed, run, and ultimately what they're all about. In connection, of course, to this great theme, it is more than a pleasure to welcome Professor Stefan Collini here this evening, Emeritus Professor of Intellectual History and in English Literature at the University of Cambridge. To give a title this evening, which you probably will all have seen, Mind Your Language, the Vocabulary of Higher Education. After degrees at Cambridge and Yale, Stefan taught at the University of Sussex before he moved to Cambridge in 1986. He's a Fellow of the British Academy, a frequent contributor to the London Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, The Guardian, many other periodicals, and he says he's an occasional broadcaster. Over the years, he's published widely, but I just want to mention 3 books this evening which seem particularly relevant. The book really that set off this discussion about the future of universities, What Are Universities For?, published in 2012. Absent Minds, Intellectuals in Britain, published in 2006. And That Noble Science of Politics, a study of 19th century intellectual history, published in 1983. Tonight's lecture is of fundamental importance to all of us here in Durham and to the wider community interested in the role and future role of universities. There have been huge shifts, as most of you know, in the way universities are regarded, the way they're funded, the way they're run, the way they're governed, and in the consideration of what they're for. And in this regard, of course, there's no one better to kick off this discussion, no one better, in some ways, who has defined this discussion. No one better, of course, than Stefan Collini, so please join with me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Good evening, everybody. I don't know if everybody can get somewhere to sit at the back there, but do try if you'd like to. Thank you, David, for that introduction. There's one seat here, which I'm certainly no longer using. You'll be very welcome to use. Go ahead. Well, as David said, there is a lot of talk about universities these days, and there is a lot to talk about. And things have been changing very fast. I think everyone would observe that across the world, the rate of expansion of higher education has been unprecedented, even in the many centuries long history of the curious institution that the university is, in purely numerical terms. But in this country in particular, I think there's been a set of changes in also what you might call the whole ecology of higher education. And this evening what I want to do is to talk about some of the ways in which I think those often more subtle, sometimes less acknowledged changes manifest themselves in the language in which higher education is discussed and conducted, and what we might think about all of that. Just to rehearse some of the things that David touched on very briefly there, we need to recognize, I think, that there has been a very dramatic change in the form of governance of universities. The notion of them as, in some sense, self-governing academic communities where the decisions are made by various groups of those who teach in them is no longer the right template. There have been enormous changes in the range of things that can be studied and taught and are researched in universities. New technologies, of course, promise to alter the very fundamental mechanisms of the whole teaching process. But also in the scale in other ways. Overseas students now constitute a very large part, perhaps some of you here now, of the population of British universities, in some institutions over a third. And of course the institutions themselves now feel the imperative to construct partnerships with institutions in other countries, or indeed to open campuses in those other countries. The sense in which globalization is being understood within universities is making a very big difference to the internal sense of identity as well as to these external activities. And all this, of course, is quite apart from the reshaping of the funding system that has been in operation since 2012, at least in England and Wales, not in your near neighbours Scotland, of course, where largely public support for education teaching has been withdrawn and replaced by a system of high fees. And this, as most of you will know, has gone along with a great many other market-oriented changes, including also, and especially in the bill that has just been passed by Parliament, including also making it much easier for a range of so-called private providers, both for-profit and not-for-profit institutions, to enter higher education. Now, although all these changes means there's lots to talk about, I would say there is widespread uncertainty about the premises and terms in which we should discuss them. I think the pace and the scale of change have produced a sense of disorientation, a kind of feeling that we may have now, as a society, lost a once shared and familiar sense of what universities were and what they were for, and yet we have not yet agreed to replace it with anything better. And the language and the categories used in politics and in the media discussion of higher education, I think, only exacerbate this problem. These categories often, of course, are drawn directly from other spheres of life, particularly business, and it's not clear that they always fit ours very well. Now, of course, there are those, and I know this as much as anybody here, I'm sure, there are those who will say, well, it doesn't really matter how we talk about them, because talk is only talk. And these people can always produce from their pockets, I've noticed, a big, solid lump of stuff called reality, and then they will tell you how talk just bounces off this. Talk is really absolutely ineffective. What matters, and I've noticed how this is often said with that mixture of both aggression and self-satisfaction, what matters is whether the policies work. We don't need all this high-flown language. I would say that as false beliefs go, that takes some beating. It wouldn't require any particularly fancy philosophical footwork on my part to establish that our experience of the world is, after all, partly constituted by the categories that we use. Words are not some kind of external decorative wrapping paper in which meaning is delivered, with the implication that they could be stripped away or others used instead. Concepts do colonize our minds, and we become used to thinking about ourselves and our world in their terms. Our actions are often only recognizable to ourselves as this action rather than that action in terms of the language in which we describe them. Now, it's possible if you thought that it didn't really matter how we talk about universities, you wouldn't have come to this lecture this evening in the first place. Or perhaps if you do, you might, in impatience, leave quite soon. But before you do, I would just ask you how you would decide any of the pressing questions about the future of universities at the moment, what somebody might call undeniable, real-world questions about how to pay for them, or how many people to admit to them, or what subjects to study in them, and so on. How you would do that without using some description of what they are and what they are for. It's not enough to say, well, these are just practical questions and they will in some way settle themselves, because I could show you very quickly, I think, that the terms in which they will get discussed and settled, if we do not try and make other terms available, have their own history, and it's something that intellectual historians are trained to pinpoint fairly precisely, the ways in which this history comes in at a certain moment. These terms are not natural, universal, or, for that matter, very long-lived in some cases. They have a very recent history dependent on a certain kind of fashion. So there's nothing, as it were, natural about thinking of universities in terms, say, of wealth creation or, say, of social mobility, any more than there was something completely natural or universal about thinking of them in terms of character formation or the propagation of God's word, or the other kinds of phrases that would have been used at previous periods of their history. So I think it matters very much how we talk about them, and it matters too that we don't just, as it were, resist change, that we try to understand the changes that are happening. If they were not important changes, of course, we could go on talking in our old ways. It's, in a way, precisely because the changes have been, I think, so fast and so fundamental that we're no longer at ease talking in our own ways. And yet, as I said just now, I think we have not yet, in a way, evolved a more agreed way to replace that old language. So one of the most fascinating, but also, as any of you who have tried to do this kind of work will know, elusive features of cultural change is the way certain ideals and arguments acquire an almost self-evident power at particular periods, just as other arguments, which once possessed that power, come to seem irrelevant or antiquated and largely to disappear from public debate. In the middle of the 18th century, to describe a measure as displaying the respect that is due to rank, that was a commonplace commendation. In the middle of the 19th century, affirming that a proposal contributed to the building of character could almost seem like the unnoticed mood music of public discussion during that period. In the middle of the 20th century, a decent standard of life was the goal that all parties and almost all policies were assumed to be aiming at. And as with the wider processes of language change, readers and listeners become inured to what were once jarring neologisms or solecisms, and phrases that were once so common as to escape notice, then in time become unusable. Now, I suppose it'll be quite a long time before historians can adequately chart, let alone explain, the changes that have happened in public discourse in Britain in the past half century. But when that task is attempted, of course, official publications do have a special kind of value as evidence. They tend not to bear the marks of an individual sensibility, but rather to deploy idioms and arguments that are thought to command the widest acceptance, even when, perhaps especially when, in some cases, the actual policy proposals these documents contain are novel and controversial. Let's remember that the relation between the legitimizing phrases and the policies is neither that of strict entailment, but nor is it one of complete randomness. Varying policies, perhaps, can lay claim to be furthering some approved general goal, but the conventional assumptions about the character of that goal will set limits to the range of policies that can do this persuasively. Now, since perhaps the 1970s and certainly the 1980s, official discourse in Britain about these matters has become increasingly colonized by an economistic idiom, one that is, I think, not strictly derived from the language of economic theory proper, but rather from such sources as management schools, business consultants, financial journalism, and so on. And British society has been subjected, we have to recognise, to a deliberate campaign initiated in the free market think tanks in the 1960s and 1970s and pushed very strongly by business leaders and right-wing commentators ever since, to elevate the status of business and commerce and to install contributing to economic growth as the overriding goal of a whole swathe of social, cultural and intellectual activities which had previously been understood in other terms. Such a campaign would not have been successful, of course, had it not been working with the grain of other changes in British society and indeed in the wider world. Very broadly speaking, the extension of democratic and egalitarian social attitudes has been accompanied by the growth of a kind of consumerist relativism. The claim that one activity is in some way intrinsically of greater value or importance than another comes to be pilloried as a form of elitism. And the only value that has any indefeasible standing is value for money. Any substantial government document dating from the last couple of decades, is, I think, immediately recognizable by the presence of the acknowledged buzz phrases of the time. It is essential to sustain economic growth and maintain Britain's global competitiveness. Consumers must have a choice of services. Competition will drive up quality, and so on. I thought that in order to sharpen our ears to what is and is not being said in such phrases when they're applied to higher education, I would just like to read out a few phrases from the celebrated Robbins report on higher education of 1963, which, as many of you will know, was one of the most important and influential public reports in this field in the whole course of the 20th century. So here are a few passages. The first comes from the introductory section of the report, which is discussing the aims of higher education, where it says, "We must postulate that what is taught should be taught in such a way as to promote the general powers of the mind. The aim should be to produce not mere specialists, but rather cultivated men and women." And the second passage, which is quite a long one, comes from the section of the report which is discussing the makeup of the academic staff in a university. And this is what it says. "There are many persons of first-class ability, particularly in the humanities, who have never engaged in research in the narrow sense or felt any urge to publish, but whose breadth of culture, ripeness of judgment, and wide-ranging intellectual curiosity are priceless assets in a department or college." None of you would think this was published yesterday. "There are others who develop powers of organization and administration that are invaluable for the smooth running of a large department. Like all communities, a university needs a diversity of gifts, and any notion that there is an ideal division between teaching, research, original work and administration to which every member of the academic staff of a university should attempt throughout his life to conform is wholly alien to the proper concept of a university. And the third one, also I'm afraid fairly long, comes from the report's discussion of the machinery of government at the national central level, that is best suited to overseeing a system of higher education, where it recommended not the continuation of the then existing, rather incongruous relation to the Treasury, nor the inclusion of universities in the responsibilities of an enlarged Ministry of Education. And of course the conceit of assigning it to a Department of Business had not yet occurred. Instead, the Robbins report recommended the formation of a new ministry, a Ministry of Arts and Science, that would include what it called other autonomous state-supported activities that are at present administered on principles resembling those of the Grants Committee, such as museums, galleries, the Arts Council and the Research Councils. And this is part of what it said in favour of that proposed arrangement. Since much of the work would be done through grants committees, the whole would tend to be informed by the special degree of detachment and respect for the autonomy of the institutions and individuals ultimately concerned that is so necessary if the connection of the state with creative activities is to be a quickening rather than a deadening influence. This would recognise the importance to the spiritual health of the community of a proper organisation of state support for learning and the arts. Now, there are lots of things that could be said about these passages, about their relation to the overall case made by the Robbins report, and about, of course, some contrasts with the situation that obtains today. But for the moment, I just want to focus on the vocabulary used in these passages and say something rather specific about it. Let me just pick out and repeat a few of those key phrases. The general powers of the mind, cultivated men and women, breadth of culture, ripeness of judgment and wide-ranging intellectual curiosity, state support for learning and the arts, and so on. Now, this is in some ways a very traditional vocabulary, and it's deployed with the confidence that comes from presuming agreement on the values it expresses. It's not, I think, a narrowly professional or specialized vocabulary. It largely identifies desirable human qualities. It's confident, indeed slightly elevated in register, but unembarrassed by that. And it implicitly acknowledges that these qualities are matters of judgment, not of quantification. And I was very struck by that sequence that talks of breadth of culture, ripeness of judgment, and wide-ranging intellectual curiosity. This occurred, remember, in the passage which says that some scholars in the humanities in particular might be of great value to their institutions, even though they might rarely do what we now call publishing research. I suppose the phrases were acknowledging that these qualities were valuable in themselves and that they made an important contribution to the proper ends of the university, and that these qualities, required the right conditions if they were to flourish. And then again, there's that phrase about state support for learning and the arts. Of course, we've become so used to the language of student learning and teaching and learning committees and so on, that we may miss here that learning is being used in its older sense, the sense which the OED defines as knowledge, especially of language or literary or historical science, acquired by systematic study, the possession of such knowledge, learnedness. And I was struck by how different that sense of learning is, where it's an accumulated condition of mature and systematic understanding, from what we now term research. Research, after all, is all about finding new knowledge, new findings, as we say, and making those findings known. Learning, well, it's more a matter, isn't it, of possessing or inhabiting an accumulated body of understanding. It's collective, not individual, and it requires a great labour to master, and certainly can't be identified with any product or output. Now, there are a lot of similar terms that were commonplace in discussion of universities several decades ago, which have now almost entirely disappeared from public discourse on these institutions. And before I go on to say something more about the dominant contemporary vocabulary and the assumptions it reveals or conceals, let me just at least try and address the question of how we might look at linguistic change a bit more systematically. I want to acknowledge here the help of a research group on the vocabulary of higher education in Cambridge called the University Keywords Group. Because what they're doing is exploiting the potential of the so-called digital humanities and big data to build up very extensive linguistic corpora and then to run various kinds of sophisticated searches of their contents. Now, I can't pretend to talk about this with the authority that they could, but the group very kindly carried out a series of searches for me on phrases and words that I suggested. In a more technical presentation of this, there'd be lots of things to say, boundary conditions you have to get clear before you do these searches, the things about the ways the different corpora are constituted, which of course affects their results, different ways of recording the findings and so on. What I'm giving you here, though, is just as it more an impressionistic layman's summary of what, when you run these little experiments on their materials, what you get. So those phrases that I isolated a moment ago from the Robbins report, the powers of the mind and breadth of culture and all that, well, the Cambridge team have several major corpora that they're using for their inquiry into the vocabulary of higher education, including the Times from 1990, complete statements of relevant government departments, especially BIS since 2009, feels like 1909, but it's only been 2009, and a general internet corpus covering the years 1996 to the present. And what they've done is, for example, search for any of the terms they're looking at, or the ones that I proposed to them, in passages that also contain words like university or universities. Now, strikingly, when every one of those phrases from the Robbins report was searched for in these various databases, the earliest of which go back, remember, to 1990. They revealed not a single occurrence of one of them, with the minor exception that the phrase intellectual curiosity occurs 3 times in the Times corpus between 1990 and the present. Now, of course, you do have to acknowledge that whole phrases are bound to come up rather less often than single words in this kind of exercise. Still, the complete absence of all these phrases is, I think, quite interesting, especially when you contrast the findings for some other terms. So in the Times corpus alone, the term innovative occurs in the relevant context no fewer than 403 times. And of course, our old friend excellence racks up an astonishing 946 occurrences. And in the more miscellaneous internet corpus, but remembering covering a lot of years, 1996 to the present, innovative, again, does exceptionally well, 664 times in relevant context. Delivery occurs 898 times. I'm sure that will affect your behaviour tomorrow. And yet again, excellence is the chart topper with 978 occurrences. Now, of course, there's a lot you could say about these rough findings, including, quite interestingly, that they don't appear to show any marked trajectory of a rise or fall of numbers across these years, which may suggest that this vocabulary was already pretty well established by the mid-late 1990s. Now, any of you familiar with this sort of work will know that you have to be on your guard against many things, including, of course, multiple meanings of words, which can inflate the totals, and they have ways of protecting their findings from this. But alongside the many uses of delivery, which are genuine, you're going to get some that are not. So one that is, alas, genuine from 1995 is one which, when I traced it to its source, says, "The imperative of restructuring the content and delivery mechanisms of higher education to reflect the urgent needs of the society is not open to serious debate." So, at least there we're saved from the tiresome necessity of serious debate. But some of these are rather less germane, even when the search term delivery is found in the context of an item referring to a university. In fact, in this case, Cambridge University. Because when I track down this particular occurrence, the relevant sentence turns out to refer to a recent delivery of woolly hats. Actually, this was not without its interest either, because it turned out that the whole sentence was, "A recent delivery of woolly hats was sent to the boat club office, but when they were unpacked, it was revealed that they were dark blue, the colours of Oxford University." Now, obviously, for my purposes, such findings are only ever going to be of illustrative or secondary importance, and there are lots of other things you can do with these large linguistic surveys. But this is one way in to thinking about patterns of linguistic change, and also then a way of thinking about what attitudes and values are carried by these changes. I think it's indisputable that in the past 2 or 3 decades, governments in Britain and increasingly elsewhere have treated universities as institutions whose performance can primarily be improved by subjecting them to particular versions of market competition or some simulacrum thereof, and then measuring the results in various ways. And I mentioned very briefly a moment ago the way that now, that's very relevant here, but perhaps too little noticed, is the way in which the generalization of the consumer model, which is entailed by the metaphor of the market, involves an agnosticism about human ends and a consequent downgrading of reasons as opposed to preferences. Now, this promises to bypass all the difficult judgments about some human activities being more worthwhile than others, and simply allows the mechanism of consumer choice in a market not just to determine outcomes, but also to confer legitimacy on them. And its strength, of course, is that no individual or group is seen to be dictating to others what they ought to want. its weakness is that it makes it harder for public discussion to address the question of whether some purposes may be humanly more valuable than others. And instead of reasons, what we are said to have are opinions. And these, of course, are treated as and derogated as merely subjective. And between them, I think subjective opinions and objective data are increasingly held to exhaust the acceptable elements in public debate. I noticed recently that Andreas Schleicher, the man behind the controversial PISA tables of international school attainment, was quoted as saying, "Without data, you are just another person with an opinion." And I thought the fact that that was allowed to pass without any critical comment at all, I think, shows how contemporary public discourse tends automatically to relegate anything that is not quantifiable to the status of subjective opinion. Now, the issue of the quality of intellectual work is bound to be a particularly vexed one in a culture of accountability, because it necessarily involves the exercise of informed judgment, which has then somehow got to be translated into purportedly objective measurement. In general terms, I think our society's solution to this problem can be expressed in a single word, a word I've already mentioned, a word that's so familiar that I think we no longer even notice that we're all using it. Practically every official statement or document issued by practically every university now will explain its aims or its mission, and by saying that it is committed to excellence. I'm not going to dwell for the moment on commitment, although I would just remark that the way in which business speak depends on harnessing, but at the same time devitalizing, the language of the emotions. You must have noticed how now no candidate for a job in any walk of life is merely interested in something. They are, of course, always passionately committed to the activity in question. And job descriptions actually now embed the same hyperbole. I saw a vacancy recently that declared to prospective applicants, "You will be passionate about stock flow control." And it's hard not to feel that would be a rather sad emotional derangement, isn't it? But as part of this same move in language, I think excellence is now the ubiquitous term for what we in universities are, of course, passionately committed to. Now, it's worth, I discovered, pondering both the derivation and the semantic range of excellence. And the thesaurus, quite rightly, gives two clusters of near synonyms for it. The first refers to those terms that indicate that something is good of its kind. And the second to those terms that suggest it is better than the others. Excellence can be used both to connote fulfilling the telos of something. It is, interestingly, quite often given as a translation of the ancient Greek term arete, but also excelling, rising above, being outstanding. So in all ordinal scales of evaluation, we're used to the idea of going through satisfactory to good to very good and on to excellent, the best. So excellence, even as a term, totters a little unsteadily between being part of an Aristotelian tautology, to attempt to fulfill any purpose is to attempt to exhibit the excellence appropriate to that activity, while also smuggling in the notion that it involves coming out top in some form of competition. Clearly no determinate meaning can be ascribed to the claim that a university is committed to excellence. Every institution presumably thinks it's ideally trying to do what it does as well as it can. Of course it's committed to excellence. What else could it be committed to? Imagine the alternative statement. Only a university committed to mediocrity in both teaching and research can attract the losers of tomorrow. Only universities vigilant about constantly lowering standards can hope to flourish in the global competition to do rather badly, and so on. But although it's strictly meaningless in that sense, the use of excellence and similar bits of patter does have a function. It signals, I think, that the university accepts the sovereignty of the current cant, especially the dominion of audit populism. Its public relations people and the corporate world's public relations people are, in another favoured cliche of our time, singing from the same hymn sheet. And it not only signals acceptance of the coercive fiction of competition, we try to excel, to beat the others, to win, but implicitly it also signals acceptance of the conventional forms of the measurement of achievement. And this is the great unspoken about excellence. Because it's entirely devoid of content in itself, its presence can only be vouchsafed by some quantitative evidence recognised by outsiders. So to be committed to excellence, I think, serves to announce that your institution will act as though there were some genuine value in being ranked in the supposedly top 100 universities in the world, or ranked in the top 10 in the ref, and so on. Yes, a university is saying, or at least its senior management team is saying, we believe in excellence, and so we will with conviction submit ourselves to these exercises and strive to do well, to excel by their criteria. We are team players. We are serious about making a contribution to society. We understand the need to be accountable. We accept the need for objective performance indicators. All this, I think, hovers around the ubiquitous discourse of excellence, and it numbs us into not noticing how far it is from an informative or accurate account of the activities of a university. And then, of course, related to it is the fallacy of continuous improvement. If the only publicly acceptable way to attend to questions of quality is by means of annual measurement against a quantitative benchmark, the imperative to so-called continuous improvement becomes both self-fulfilling and, of course, self-contradictory. The logical conclusion of such a process is obviously a situation in which 100% of students get top firsts, 100% of staff get maximum external grants, 100% of departments get 4-star research ratings, and so on. When we get to that moment, by the way, we will have reached what I saw again in an advertisement from a university recently, which said that it aims to go beyond excellence. Just to revert for a moment to the findings of the Cambridge team and their linguistic corpora, there's another set of interesting questions about the frequency of the conjunction of certain terms that can be revealing, although subject to all the same caveats that I mentioned earlier. So, not very surprisingly, the term which appears most frequently in conjunction with outputs in their searches is produce. Only slightly less predictable, the term which occurs most frequently in conjunction with excellence is promote. Even so, that seemed to me a phrase to brood on. To say the aim of universities is to promote excellence, yes, we hardly notice it, but isn't there something revealing about the idea of an obligation to promote excellence? We use promote as a loose synonym for encourage or to further, to support, but there's actually a rather different semantic train that it can bring with it, where to promote is more akin to advertise or to boost. When officials from government departments go on a trip to promote British businesses abroad, we know that they're acting as glorified sales reps. And all of this does make one wonder what exactly is involved in promoting excellence. Is it encouraging people to do their best, or is it more like claiming that what they do is the best? Let me now turn to a different kind of phrase, and it's one that has for some time been ubiquitous in official documents about universities, above all when discussing funding. And that is the term efficiency gains. Now, it may seem that there's not much to be said about efficiency gains. We know it's a polysyllabic euphemism for cuts most often. And it may be that criticism seems needless. But even here, I think, there is something we can learn. The context, as I say, is nearly always that of funding levels and the need for reductions in expenditure. The phrase is used when a document wants to insist that a given level of expenditure is to be reduced, but without anything specific, certainly anything valuable, having to be sacrificed. It's saying you'll receive less money, but you'll continue to do all the good things you did before, just more efficiently. So the premise here is that there's always, to use another term from the lexicon of hard-boiled administrative realism, there's always some fat in the system, something that could be cut. What's the status of that premise? It can scarcely be thought to rise to the dignity of a metaphysical or ontological assertion along the lines of the nature of reality is such that removing or reorganizing any of its constituent processes will always have an exclusively beneficial consequence. No, not as general as that. Okay, well then the fact perhaps is more historical than metaphysical. So it becomes a claim something like, as institutions evolve, some parts or procedures become superfluous. But that can't quite be it, because it's reasonable to suppose that in most cases those superfluous elements are removed as part of the development. So then the emphasis has to fall on the superfluousness of these elements having gone unrecognized hitherto. But in that case, how do those now responsible for reducing the funding know that they exist? So we need a supplementary premise to the effect that universities are typically rather slack institutions, and financial discipline, another of those terms, will force them to tighten up. But note, there's no way to identify or quantify the forms of slackness in advance. It's impossible to say whether they are equivalent to 1% reduction in funding or a 25% reduction in funding. In practice, the phrase efficiency gains is mostly only used of relatively small percentage reductions. Otherwise, the implausibility of what it suggests would be too obvious. And the institution that says it cannot make such gains is never to be believed. It's axiomatic that they can be made. But in what fantasy land does that assertion really belong? After all, what it's saying in effect is, we don't know what should be cut, and we don't know how much of it there is. But we're certain it corresponds to the amount by which, for other reasons, we want to reduce your funding. Now, and what's more, there could be no way to know in advance whether the reduction was too great and so caused perhaps fatal damage. This would be like a surgeon saying to a patient, I'm going to remove 2% of your body each year. I believe the efficient functioning of your body won't be harmed thereby. In fact, it'll be improved. I don't know which bits to remove, and we'll only know that we've taken the wrong bits. Actually, of course, in universities it's more like not that. It's like the surgeon saying, here's the scalpel, you do it. Part of what I think is so galling about the use of the language of efficiency gains is the combination of arrogance and indifference. The arrogance is obvious, I trust, and the indifference lies in the way that no interest is taken in how it's done or what bleeding ensues. Of course, the metaphor of fat, like so many of these, has a wider world that it's part of. In making an organisation leaner and so on is sharing that discourse that extends as far as diets and gyms and all the rest of it. You know, recipes for meat dishes often say trim off the excess fat. Well, you do think, how do you know what in this case is excess fat? I mean, you could think possibly the fourfold increase in administrative staff in British universities in the past 30 years might be perhaps in this category, but actually efficiency gains only refer, it turns out, to academic staff. So there's this aesthetic of leanness which somehow universities have embraced, and you'll notice that lean is always dynamic and efficient. Fat, interestingly, is never dynamic or efficient or competitive. Fat, flabby, soft, sluggish, and so on. Making an organisation leaner is, of course, by definition good. It's interesting, incidentally, that there seems to be no anxiety about encouraging anorexia in this bit of discourse. Now, there are a whole host of terms which this kind of analysis, it seems to me, when you look at them closely, could be subject to. One of my favourites, which I won't spend time on, but favourites just for purely playful reasons, is grant capture. I love grant capture because I'm never sure whether this conjures up the world of pirates and their booty. You know, we swing down onto the deck of HMS Leverhulme or something, or whether it suggests a world in which wild grants are roaming free. Although, I mean, strictly, since we don't say grant recapture, they presumably haven't escaped from somewhere. But either way, it suggests, doesn't it, this sort of vigorous, outdoorsy, masculine activity, so that academics are in some cross between Ernest Hemingway and Captain Hook. But that one is for purely playful purposes. Now, let me change focus again and look at an entirely different word, which is a very serious one in current discussions of universities, and which I think, again, nobody has really attended to. And that is the word silos. Use of this word, and it's used mostly to refer to academic departments or disciplines, use of the word is, I think, a signal that one is supposed to be viewing the topic from a perspective that's not only liberated from or superior to that of entrenched or self-interested groups, but it's also hostile to the autonomy that has been involved in allowing the relevant scholarly subcommunity to be the arbiters of intellectual significance. Using this term is part of a discourse which says, but of course like most of the terms I'm discussing, it does this implicitly, sometimes only subliminally, it says that the important questions now transcend existing disciplinary boundaries. And so only those who are freed from the commitments and attachments associated with those existing disciplines can be relied upon to identify and pursue the really important questions. These may be academics who have in some way put themselves forward as willing to be the institutional entrepreneurs, in which case, of course, they will find themselves objects of great managerial approval. Or, of course, they may be academic administrators who are empowered to create new units and, very importantly, new funding lines. Silos is, I think, part of that, what I call that tough demotic, that reveals the speaker to be a hard-nosed realist about this state of the world, the kind of person who constantly uses such phrases as "at the end of the day," "in your dreams," "it ain't gonna happen," and so on, all about hard-headedness. What's not noticed, I think, is that it's part of the larger bid for approval from bodies and groups outside the university, who are always ready to assume that the constitutional defect of universities is a combination of irrelevance, traditionalism, and inward-lookingness. Those still imprisoned, as it's put, in the academic units and scholarly traditions, which are being derided by the use of the term silos, they just don't get this. The academics whom the managers can do business with, another phrase from that lexicon, are those who've got out of the silos. And indeed, of course, unless the speakers are very careful, they'll soon find themselves praising such figures for thinking outside the box and so on, where the box again represents all that's hidebound, narrow, unimaginative. I do think it's remarkable how much of the vocabulary of contemporary academic life is shot through with assumptions derived from an external mode of discourse that is fundamentally unsympathetic to universities. Now, the language of the passages I quoted earlier from the Robbins report, as I was saying, are in some respects accurate and well-informed about, for example, what the role of a university teacher is actually like. And I think to pick out that teaching is not, as it said, simply the patient recapitulation and explanation of the known, or that university teachers need time for reflection and personal study if they are to keep abreast of new developments in their subjects and so on. These are phrases now which would absolutely stand out and be out of place in current high ed speak, precisely because, I think, they are modest yet confident in tone, rather than being, as so many of our phrases are, all outer bluster and inner defensiveness. Lionel Robbins, by the way, the chairman of the report that bears his name, it should be remembered, was himself a leading neoclassical economic theorist and no admirer of socialism or left-wing ideas more generally. The case against the shift in public discourse that I'm sketching here does not, I think, involve any repudiation of the legitimate and indispensable role of economic reasoning. any more than it involves any supposedly utopian disregard for the financial cost of proper support for public services, education included. Also, I want to make very clear that pointing to the damage which I think is in train now in universities by the use of so much of this language and the models about competing producers and rational consumers that it brings with it, does not, I think, have to express any nostalgia or desire to return to what was, after all, a far smaller, far more selective higher education system 3 or 4 decades ago. I would say that I think the expansion of the age cohort entering higher education in this country, going back to the early 60s, was about 5 or 6%, is now up above 45%. I think that's a great democratic gain, and I think it's one this society should not wish to retreat from. But quite to the contrary, I think we should be seeking to ensure that those new university entrants are not cheated of their legitimate entitlement to an education and not palmed off in the name of meeting the needs of employers with a narrow training that is thought, at least it seems to me sometimes is thought by some right-wing policy formers to be good enough for the likes of them, because it turns out that the children of the privileged classes will still get to attend rather well-resourced institutions, both at school and tertiary level. I think the measures adopted in the past 6 years are not fundamentally about finding fairer ways to pay for higher education, or in any meaningful sense about putting students at the heart of the system, as successive governments have claimed. I think they are the latest instalment, and there's many instalments no doubt yet to come, in what surely we can see as a campaign to, if you like, replace the assumptions of Robbins's world with those of McKinsey's world. And one of the reasons why I'm urging that we should engage in some alert critique of such language is precisely because the impoverished vocabulary used in official documents of the kind I've been quoting from involves an impoverished conception of the activity they're seeking to regulate. Now, of course, there are a lot of wider social forces that reinforce this vocabulary. Many things that I've talked about here are not unique to universities, but we do not, even so, have to be the entirely passive prisoners of this discourse. And through repetition, the use of this kind of language becomes so internal that it takes a very large effort, I think, of criticism, the kind of estrangement from our everyday language that's involved in all genuine critique, to stop it becoming completely naturalized. Terms, as I said earlier, that at one point we, probably quite a lot of people in this room, were rather shocked by, thought seemed very rebarbative or inadequate, become the terms in which we get used to conducting our affairs on a daily basis. And that means we end up making the reality more and more conform to what those terms describe. Just consider, as a very small example, the ubiquity now of judging whether a piece of work is refable and what has followed from that. I do think that academics have some responsibility here, including responsibility to try to speak out about this. We don't want to be accused simply of speaking to each other, but we do need to speak to each other from time to time, because I do think internally, in our activities in universities, we need to do what we can to keep a more accurate and a more expressive language still alive in our everyday interactions, even when we know that with part of ourselves we have also to carry out measures which are phrased in this quite alien language. I've just published a book called Speaking of Universities, partly to acknowledge the centrality of matters of language in this sense, that it does, I think, matter enormously how we speak about these things. Now, I know that there are grave and judicious persons who think that speaking about these things in this way, especially causing an audience to smile from time to time, or attending to the language of official documents which were not intended to be set pieces for seminars in literary criticism, after all, that this is, as the current vocabulary has it, this is not helpful. Well, we have to think about that. Any suggestion of literary tactics failing is obviously an important suggestion, and we don't want to be counterproductive. But I have to say, I think that misunderstands the character of criticism and the genres of writing it that are involved here. And maybe the shortest way, although I realise it's the way that's most open to misunderstanding, but anyway, the shortest way to make the point is to say that I think such critical writing is not meant to be helpful, at least not in the sense, the limited practical sense, in which, for example, a suggestion is made when a committee is round a table trying to refine the wording of some document or policy. I've spent a lot of time in such settings, alas, as has any senior academic, I suppose. And I know what it takes to get a view heard there, but I also know how limited is the range of considerations that are felt to be relevant or constructive in those practical circumstances. Criticism, I think, fundamental criticism, is doing something else. Sometimes such criticism may be saying the present terms of the discussion systematically exclude what, from another point of view, would be fundamental to this issue. And there are times, I think, when criticism needs to be fairly swinging, if that criticism is to be attended to at all. Trying to be, in the approved way, helpful at those points will simply allow the existing consensus to deceive itself that it's heard some relevant objections, but on balance decided against them. And that's surely the lie at the heart of so many exercises in consultation. But also, none of this writing, certainly none of the writing in the book that I've just published, takes the form of a memo or a policy document to be circulated to a committee. We're talking about forms here, surely, of journalism and other kinds of writing and speaking which is addressed to diverse audiences. We have to address diverse audiences. And if you're to hold the interest of such readers, then it cannot be phrased simply like a civil service document or a report. Whether I or anyone else does that successfully is a whole other question. But as a matter of truth about the genres, that must be so. If a piece of criticism is to be attended to, if it's to be heard, if it's to be finished when people start reading it, then questions of other kinds of tone, other kinds of address have got to come in order to get that level of attention. And it's not clear to me that a certain kind of high-spiritedness is axiomatically out of place. I think any idea of the university that can only be expounded in dull prose is failing its topic. So I am unabashed about not presenting all of this in sober, pinstriped prose. You'll form your own judgments about whether it's effective or not. But I do think that we in universities are collectively responsible for trying to get these cases articulated, trying to identify to ourselves and to each other a better vocabulary to keep alive, and then to use that in justifications of our activities to the wider society. In our form of modern multimedia societies, the received wisdom, and it's often very cliched forms of expression, enjoy huge advantages in public debate. And views and phrases that are so ceaselessly reiterated come to be part of the cultural weather. They're so natural that they escape notice. They certainly escape challenge. I'm perhaps offering you a small incitement to focus on what is actually happening and on the cliches behind which that hides. It's an incitement to think again, think more clearly, and then press for something better. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stefan. I mean, I think that brilliantly captures the waves that are washing over British universities, and particularly our own university. A voluntary redundancy scheme was recently announced for all staff. There's no clear aims and objectives attached to it, except those wonderfully described already by you. That is to cut the fat, cut which is unnecessary, slim down, deliver our products more efficiently. And when challenged, that's been said it by me, as to why we're introducing a voluntary redundancy scheme before we had a different conception of what our operational mode should be, there was head scratching. So it fits in beautifully, I think.
I'm
and
sorry to hear it.
Alarmingly, and alarmingly.
Yes.
Let me just start by asking you a question about the languages that you've used. I mean, if you compare this to the discourses in France and Germany now, for instance, what are you struck by? I mean, is this essentially, it's not an Anglo-American phenomenon, because American universities, by and large, have a greater confidence. Certainly some of them display a much greater confidence and do not subject their staff and students to these regimes. So this is, in a way, it's a particular cultural form, it's a particular language which is not universal. So I wonder what do you think explains its prevalence here as opposed to elsewhere?
Well, I think your premises are quite right. I mean, first thing very quickly to say, and everyone already knows this at some level, we can't talk about a system of higher education in the United States. It's a vastly diverse world of higher education institutions, some 4,000 at current count. Interestingly, the majority are public, although that is, of course, not the kind of institution that we mostly hear about. We hear about mainly the private big research universities. And the attitudes that you touched on, David, which I think are there in the more confident, big research universities, which are mostly private, are not there in many state universities, which have some of the same vulnerabilities. And of course, there are many, many more lower-level institutions in the United States, community colleges and so on, which are often in desperate straits. One of the things that's interesting about those research universities is, I would say, that now the academic faculty there in the United States are by and large in a stronger position than academic faculty in corresponding British universities. It's not that common, of course, that academics being academics, they all get together to press for one thing and be of one mind. But in certain notorious or famous cases, when they do, it has a lot of clout in those universities, and that their voice is more powerful than I think is now true in any British university. Many different European models, of course. One of the big differences here, different among different European countries, but markedly different from most North European countries to the UK, is that universities have, for a mixture of historical reasons, been seen as above all the bearers of civic values, and very often, as in, say, the French case, of republican values. That there is a political mission, in some sense, acknowledged in universities, and which has attracted a certain amount of public support, even mildly, perhaps you might say, deference. I think what you singled out is that in Britain we have some of the effects of what's the most advanced form of capitalist analysis in the United States, with some of the forms of central funding and control from the most statist higher education systems in Europe, whereas those two systems don't have that conjunction. Right. There is no central demand in the United States, there is no equivalent of the REF because there's no central funding about research. Correspondingly, in many European countries there is quite strong central control of universities, sometimes much more directly than in Britain. The Minister of Education in certain Romance language countries in Europe is a very dominant figure in these respects. But they do not have, as it were, the same Anglo-Saxon free market model of public service funding and so on. So I think Britain has become, since the 1980s, as it were, a uniquely unhappy mixture of powerfully centralized funding system and control with powerfully reductive economistic analysis.
Quite. Wonderful, brilliantly put. Pietro.
Well, thank you very much. It was, I'm not sure wonderful is the right word to describe it, given what we're talking about, but I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to ask you a few things. So I'll be brief though. You mentioned that the language we use is important, and I agree with you, but I wonder whether the language is so crucial in a way. I wonder whether the language that is employed is by itself not what determines what actually goes on. I mean, you mentioned just right now that we have this unhappy mix of the values of the market and the delivery system of the Soviet Union. And, you know, historically speaking, it seems like an unlikely synthesis for the 20th century, if you wanted to apply it to any institution. But so this seems to be what we've been given. So let's imagine that we were really for an economic conception of our institutions. I mean, this is not how we would organize things if this was really the ultimate set of values that we were going to adopt. There must be something else. The really efficient performing companies of today don't work in the way that you know, sometimes it is suggested which work. So I mean, Google, Facebook, Silicon Valley, they don't work with committees and forums. I mean, I've never worked for one of them, but you know, the accounts that I have are not like that. My sense is that the constituencies to which we are ideally accountable to just don't like us, and that the language that is employed here is just an instrument to discipline something that they either don't understand or simply are not very fond of. The public is being squeezed by 30 years of economic integration, and they don't simply understand why we would be so special as to, you know, be different. The politicians, and I'm being very coarse here, simply don't see why they should be financing people who constantly tell them how inadequate they are. So maybe the language is just a vehicle for, you know, telling us how much they don't like us.
Well, you said a lot of different things there.
Yeah,
No. What I was going to say is that an awful lot of them I agree with. To take out a couple before getting on to the last point, it's so true, I think, that the actual practice of the most successful businesses in the world is not at all like the procedures being forced on universities in the name of becoming more businesslike. Since I've gone around giving my sermons about universities, I've from time to time been on panels with people from different business sectors, and it's very striking to me that the, as it were, more successful, the more international, the bigger their company, the more these business leaders say, we don't want this to happen to universities. What we value about universities is what you do well. We want you to nurture creativity, extend your students' horizons. We'll do the on-the-job training or whatever. They'll be out of date if you try and do it, as it were. And they want, you mentioned a company like Google, they more and more want the flexibility of so-called flat hierarchies rather than the rigidities of this great machinery of committees and subcommittees and so on. So I think that is certainly true, that I think the language is itself an index of a rather out-of-date notion, or at least inapplicable notion of business as a model. I think it's also true that the way in which, I mean, David could talk about this with more authority than I could, the way in which the alleged improvement of public services has been sought in the last 3 or 4 decades is a very curious mixture of free market ideology and state dirigisme. This is true in the health service, this is true now, alas, increasingly in schools, and this is exactly what I think, as I said, is happening in universities. It's not a pure free market system in any sense. And even when we've had, since 2010, the most, as it were, ramped up market fundamentalism about this, what we saw were a succession of ad hoc measures designed to control from the centre how these things were. Remember ABB, about 2 years when this was the determining thing about entrance and figures and so on. Then that was dropped suddenly, replaced by something else. There's been a lot of centralized control in that way. I entirely agree about that. But I don't think I would say that that's, I mean, forgive me, I'm not saying you suggest this, but I don't think we can conclude from that that it's, as it were, just an expression of hostility to universities. I think we are, in this respect, an example of things that are happening more broadly in terms of public provision in this society, although it may also be that certain kinds of educational and cultural institutions, think, say, of the BBC, are very vulnerable to a particular kind of populist resentment which can be harnessed behind this. I do think that is true. But even when all of that is said, it won't surprise you to learn that I don't think the question of the language is so minor or so, as it were, merely superficial. I think once you start using this consumerist vocabulary, you actually nurture the attitudes which start to make it true. And I would say that this has now, in the last 5 years, started to happen with student attitudes towards their institutions and towards their teachers and towards the grades they get. We've paid for this. We've paid a lot of money. We have now certain consumer rights to this. And yes, that's to do with actual legislative changes, but those changes were couched in a particular way, and the students encouraged to use that language in a particular way. So I think these things come together, but we're not in a position to. I remember in the heady days of student protests in the early 1970s that we were going to bring capitalism to its knees. We were often going to do this by sitting in the common room or, blocking the Vice-Chancellor's parking space or something. Well, we're not going to bring capitalism to its knees, but we at least do have some control over the language we use. And I think, as I said, that we use among ourselves and internally. So that, I think, is one good reason to focus on that.
In order to get the discussion going, do you mind if I take
Yes, because otherwise they all get long answers like that.
I want questions to be short too, so they inspire short answers.
Right, short answers.
3 questions now. Perhaps you could say who you are.
I'm Ray Land from the School of Education, Professor of Higher Education. You talked about the discourse of economic liberalism as an external motive, as a colonising discourse, alien in that sense. But it seems to me in more or less exactly the same period as the intrusion of that discourse, there's been a development of another discourse, which is the discourse of pedagogy and the nature of learning in higher education, which, if you go back to Robbins, I'll try and keep this short, if you go back to Robbins, for example, there's nothing in Robbins about that. I mean, I looked up assessment in Robbins. It's not mentioned at all. It was used, in fact, once in a footnote, whereas now probably assessment feedback would go platinum in your kind of hit. I just wonder, and this isn't an Anglo-American phenomenon, or Commonwealth, you don't get it in Spain, France, the medieval countries, Soviet Union and so on. I wonder whether you see this discourse as a kind of collusive discourse to do with the implementation of the consumerist model, or whether this actually could be an alternative discourse which could be a site for resistance. I mean, for example, the student experience, I think, is something you can commodify and you can market, but you can't you can't commodify transformative learning. You can't commodify conceptual change and ontological shift and so on. So I wonder if you have a view on that.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, Mark Robertson, I'm a PhD student of David's. My background is in industry. My question relates to the new higher education bill. You mentioned at the start of your talk about uncertainty and anxiety being rife, and I suppose for a lot of people that's epitomised by the new higher education bill. There are others who think it actually provides for good, in inverted commas, universities, huge opportunity, and that it has to be grasped, it's not going away, and we should take a more positive outlook on some of the things that it introduces. I just wonder if, which camp you're in, and if you did think there was some opportunities there, what institutions such as Cambridge and Durham could do to grasp it.
Thank you. My name is Tom. I'm the principal of the school locally. I'm wondering what your advice would be to Vice Chancellors in terms of the language shift that they should make in their institutions, and would that apply also to the principals of colleges, the head teachers of schools?
Maybe we'll just take one more. Yes, gentlemen back. We'll have another round.
How new do you think this language really is? I've been looking in my research at the teaching of French in the 17th century in England, and have looked at some of the teaching manuals that private tutors have used, and there's a lot of sense of competition in language, talking about excellent methods, excellence, etc. So I think this sort of competition and notion of marketing existed long before present.
Just let me add one comment to that. Just listening to you, I mean, I think Britain has a distinctive political economy in some respects. It's a very open economy. It's dominated by the City of London in some ways. But it comes to a crunch in the 70s when the British model of industrial development in the post-war period just seems to break down. And that is the context in which Margaret Thatcher comes to power with her distinctive brand of marketization and handbags. You know, markets plus handbags, markets plus bank. And in a sense, Blair carries that on. He accepts that you have to expand the market, the argument that you have to expand the market, but he wants to regulate it no longer through direct interventions and control, but rather through regulatory KPIs and so on. So it seems to me in Britain, this is the peculiar form of almost authoritarian regulation of markets that starts, you know, from the late 70s onwards, and has that very distinctive Thatcher then Blair idiom. Just anyway,
And then you enjoined me to be brief. Let's think. I'm going to take these in, well, they're all quite hard, but I'm going to take them, I suppose, in ascending order of difficulty. I mean, in a way I can be brief about what you've said, Ed, because I agree with it. And when I've said that I think there's been a particular campaign launched by those free market think tanks in the 60s and 70s, that was when they felt at that point they were in the minority. They were protesting against what they saw as the kind of decayed Keynesianism of the public sphere, and that they came into their own in the 80s and subsequently. And precisely that they changed that model, and then the public interest is to be guaranteed by regulation or assessment. I think that is the overarching political economy model under which we are living. I'm afraid I can say very little about the how new question in terms of 17th century refs and TEFs and so on. I would just say in all seriousness that I do think you, and I've tried to write about this, I do think you see a constant oscillation or tension between, as it were, what, using abstract labels, you might call more instrumental and more idealist views about education, including in any given university. I mean, British civic universities in the late 19th century were on the whole founded to be instrumental institutions, to promote local industry, to prepare people for employment in local industry and so on. And for a mixture of very complicated historical reasons, they became more like traditional universities in the course of the 20th century and embrace what you might call some of the more idealist justification in doing so. Those impulses, I think, are constantly in tension in that way and are not very new. About the particular example, I can only defer to your knowledge of that, I'm afraid. Advice to VCs. Well, I haven't got a good answer to this, other than simply to say, I do think asking your own academics how the language is going down wouldn't be a bad thing to do occasionally, and to ask why it's not going down well. This is a very big subject, but it is an attempt to answer very briefly what you're getting at. I do think the fact that so many senior university administrators now are not, in any sense, academics, and have no intention of, if they were academics, of returning to ordinary academic activities of research and teaching, has opened a gap, which is also a gap in vocabulary, and that some attempt to reduce that, we're probably not going to go back to the days when people took a turn as a dean or pro-vice-chancellor and then returned to the ranks, although there was something to be said for that. But if we're not, then I think some attempt to draw upon the responses of your staff rather than simply impose this language might have something to be said for it. Discourse of pedagogy, that's an extremely interesting question, and I mean, I sense you could answer it probably better than I could. I am struck that, I mean, as you all know better than I, the whole language, perhaps I shouldn't keep saying that, the whole world of thinking about education, especially higher education, has been professionalized in the last generation. Essentially, there are people, perhaps like yourself, for whom this is your principal professional activity in a way that it's not for somebody like me. And that maybe has had both the effects you mention. I mean, that is to say that it has both nurtured more critical thinking about what's involved in teaching and education in ways that might lead to a certain kind of resistance to some of these measures. And at the same time, it's industrialized the activity, and it's enabled, as is the case with schools, I think, ministers to draw upon this in their proposals to impose certain measures of tests and so on, which are said to be underwritten by research into pedagogy, although usually contested research, but in a way that was not true. A Minister of Education in the 60s did not have access, I think, to the same volume of professional work. And I think it is true that works both ways, but there would be more to be said about that. The one I've left to last is the one that I can't deal with at all, I think, really, which is the, alas, it's no longer a higher education bill, it's now a higher education act, as of the week before last. Is it an opportunity? I have great difficulty seeing it as that. I mean, there are so many different parts to this act, and perhaps many of you here are familiar with this, but it includes, after all, let's forget, making it much, much easier for commercial companies to set up universities. Don't need Privy Council approval, don't need a whole range of qualifying activities that they used to need, can be done within a couple of years. There's going to be less constraint on where the profits go and so on. I do not see that as an opportunity for anything except the hedge funds and so on. The TEF is a very much contested thing, as we all know. I don't take the view that teaching in British universities was beyond criticism, very, very far from it. But it is very difficult to see that the metric-driven approach, and above all with the metrics they currently have in place, is going actually to improve that. What it's going to do is lead to the same games playing that the REF has generated. People will start finding more and more effective ways to massage the student survey scores. More that it's tied to subsequent employment rates is going to narrow the range of the curriculum and so on. So I'm afraid I'm one of those who don't see this as a great opportunity, but I would certainly say that we're going to have to live under it.
One more.
Yep, please.
Thank you very much. I'm a PhD student. I'm also involved in the student union, so I sit in a lot of committees. So I'm sure, like many people in this room, the language is sort of flagged up as extremely recognisable to me. And in addition to things about outputs and excellence being competitive globally is something we hear a lot and used as an excuse for all sorts of things. So trying to raise a point about the effect of spiralling student numbers on life in the city centre, and the response is, well, we've got to increase student numbers to be competitive globally, and with that there's taken so self-evident that there's no discussion on life and residence here in Durham. And I found that one of the biggest challenges in any of the sorts of meetings that I have is encouraging people on our side of the discussion, whether as students or as academics or researchers and some of the other committees I sit on, not to accept, to challenge the terms or the confines of the questions being posed to us. It's to say, well, no, we're not just here to talk about how we adapt the teaching, the academic calendar of the year, but also asking why we're doing this and why we think it's necessary to align our academic semesters with the United States, for example. So I totally align with what you're saying about we need to actually speak with each other, develop an alternative language that can at least be there and there to challenge the university when need be and to challenge the government. But then that leads to my question, which is, what are the spaces to do this and what's happened to those spaces in the same period as this linguistic shift that you identify has occurred? So I sit on numerous bodies as a student rep for research, education, student union, and I realised recently I'm actually quite unique in horizontally cutting across a lot of these structures in universities. So I think we're going ability to change things. Maybe people only sit in one of those and say, oh, well, they'll never listen to our political committee because we're just one little grain of sand in the overall structure. So that's on the terms of the formal institutional level, the university being able to divide people up and just talk to the staff on one hand, the research students on another one, the undergrads on the other hand. And then there's the question of also just the physical space in departments where space for academics is being gotten rid of in favour of space for teaching, and so on and so forth. The pressure for academics, where do they just get the chance to sit down and speak to each other at great length?
You got there. Yeah. You got there.
Actually, my question was actually basically the same as that one.
Sure.
I'll just give one small reference, which is, which in a sense is part of my experience of working at the university and feeling that there, as an academic, that there was very little space in which public issues in relation to the university could be discussed. So there's a kind of lack of oxygen. And this is related to some of the things that have been spoken about here. There's an interesting web page of the one of the people that does look at the campaign for the public universities, the Cable website, and it showed from 2014. There's a web page which it was just after some news to come out that the funding changes made with the 2011 kind of reforms were not producing a saving for the government, at least in the immediate term, because they were having to pay out for all of the kind of higher fees. And it showed it depicted, it had three images of academics in relationship to these questions. And one of these three images there were three images of ostriches. Firstly, a picture of an ostrich kind of looking straight, being told this news, this is what's happening. Secondly, the picture of the ostrich burying his head in the sand, thinking about these things. And then thirdly, them kind of running around like kind of crazy after they'd been this has been passed on. And I do feel that the kind of burying one's head in the sand, I don't really want to accuse my fellow academics of this too strongly, but it has, in a sense, kind of been part of the landscape. And of course that's about reduced possibilities for effective speech, but at the same time it's been very frustrating to kind of live with it. And I do think that your work has spoken out, but it has been very difficult for many other academics to find spaces in which they could feel they could speak out.
Others or? This person at the back of the...
Hello, Caroline Dower. I'm a psychotherapist and I run the counselling and mental health services here. I'm really struck by the high levels of anxiety amongst students and staff, and we are anxious in relation to external approving others, whether they are our tutors or indeed external bodies. When people are anxious, they don't think very well. They don't take the space and time to think. So I'm interested in your thoughts in how we can support everybody at every level to get some space and freedom from these external others to develop an internal space to think and reflect.
Well, I mean, these three questions obviously are very closely connected, and I wish I had some magic wand or cheerier response to give. I mean, I have to say, I think that these three questions and statements diagnose something that is actually all too familiar. Just to go back to something I said in the talk, I do think that talking about these things to each other can happen at many different levels. I'll just give you a very mundane example. To the great amusement of my colleagues, given that I'd ranted on about it so much, I was in charge of our ref submission last time round. And I found that I was deliberately adopting a kind of dual discourse approach, which is when dealing with my colleagues individually, especially younger colleagues, I was attempting to say to them, if you start far enough in advance of this process, you know, the thing really is for you to write what you have in you to write, to do good work. And people like me and the other old lags who are stuck with running the place will be the barrier between you and, as it were, higher powers. It's up to us to present the case. We've got to try and make the space for you to do really good work. turning the other way, of course, addressing the higher bodies of the university, we were saying something different. We were saying, you know, what a very tight ship we run and how we're going to, you know, go through all these procedures in ways that entirely conform to the guidelines and so on, as indeed we did, as indeed we did. But that's only an example, I think, of how talking to each other, making space to, in some sense, alert a potentially very alienated and dispirited colleague that this process is not the only way we see what we're all doing. I mean, whether in the case I mentioned, you know, it was what I was trying to do was effective or not, it's very debatable, obviously. But it is an example, I think, of where we can, among ourselves, keep some of these values alive. And then going back to the first question, actually I was going to mention some of the campaigns that have been mounted about universities, especially since 2010. And of course, with electronic media and websites, these are very easily accessible. And one of the things I think they do, you see this in other areas of life, of course, is they pool resources. They're ways of communalizing experience to some extent. In Quebec, as you may know, student protest was very unusually successful in the years 2012 to 14, I think it was 2011 to 13. Very unusually successful, and quite a lot's been written about this by people who took part in it and how they succeeded and so on. As Simon mentioned, there have been campaigns in this country, campaigns for public universities, Council for Defence of British Universities and so on. I'm not sure what the NUS has run about this. I would say on the whole, both the NUS and University and College Union, the staff union, have actually been rather feeble on these matters. But nonetheless, I think looking to collective responses, trying to contribute to collective responses, and Durham is one way in which one can, I think, partly compensate for the isolation that's often felt in one particular institution. And then on the question of whether it's difficult to speak out, I mentioned this to one or two people before we came into the talk, that one or two places I've been over the last few years, somebody has come up to me afterwards and said, well, of course, I entirely agree with what you say, but you know, and they sort of look around, wouldn't dare say that here. And I've been shocked and wonder if that's just paranoia. I mean, you know, people come up to you after a lecture, there are all kinds of nutters come up to you after a lecture. But actually I don't think so. I think these are people, they may be mistaken in their judgment of this, although I think they were reflecting not just an individual judgment. But I do think that there are institutions, higher education institutions in this country, where it is not easy to take a critical line on some of these things for fear of not, you know, the most overt forms of persecution, but for fear of being in other ways unfavoured, for fear of the consequences generally. And it's a shocking thought that in universities of all places, expressing a critical view is something that people daren't do. So I'm not simply blithe about that. I do think there are real obstacles to doing this, and you know, maybe in some people's cases the can't remember which it was, the second ostrich position is the rational one for some people to take. And finally, just to say a very obvious thing, and it may go back to what you're saying about anxiety, extraordinary speeding up of business in, of course, again, not just universities, but people are much busier. And I do think that among the casualties of that, maybe that some of their mental health is among the casualties, but among the casualties of that is the energy and time to contribute to debate in any local public sphere. I mean, you're just so busy during the day, so many other things then to go on to do. The thing that will get neglected is going to that meeting, preparing to speak up, getting some colleagues together to protest about something or whatever. It's just not easy to do. I do think that is one of the reasons for it.
There's another issue here, I think, and it's just the other side of the consumerization of universities, which is what we're talking about, is the consumerization of students. That is to say, to borrow a phrase from my old friend Stuart Hall, we've all been interpolated into the sort of post-70s discourse, which creates a paradigm of consumption orientations. And some of the anxiety might be that when we think we can't succeed in that, the anxieties just become enormous because we don't have other models. And as those who teach and those who engage in colleges note that our students are much more instrumental than they used to be. But I don't think that's their fault. That's the other side of the coin. That is to say, they're also locked into these structures, and they know that if these expensive structures, which carry enormous costs and expectation of success, and if they can't attain that, or they don't meet their family's expectations, or they can't attain it in one way or another, then the anxieties become enormous.
Yeah, I mean, the more you use performance indicators, the more you will have performance anxiety as well.
Yeah.
Totally true.
Well, let me just finish by saying you performed really well. You met all the KPIs for this this evening, and I really think you can sleep well, and knowing that you succeeded. Anyway, thank you very much, Stefan.